Hi, and welcome to Ones and Twos, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Washington, D.C. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, as I mentioned last week, we have tickets that are now officially on sale for our live show in Washington, D.C. The venue is 6th and I. It's a beautiful venue. Listeners may know it if you're in the D.C. area. Tickets are starting to sell, so we'd love to see you there. You can find the link to the tickets in our show notes, so check that out and get the tickets soon if you're interested. So otherwise, we have one data point for you this week, and that is 33, as in the 33rd edition of the Summer Olympics, which opened last week in Paris and is continuing right now.
The excitement is building, and the first Olympic athletes have arrived in Paris. Hundreds began checking into the Olympic Village today.
The 2024 Summer Olympic Games are now underway. The opening ceremony was a spectacle to behold as thousands of athletes traveled down the Seine River and witnessed the lighting of the Olympic torch.
Of course, the Olympics are the premier sporting event in the world, but they are also a major economic undertaking. So we thought we'd try to unpack that a bit. Adam, I wanted to start off, though, with an ideological question, because the Olympics aren't just an event. They are kind of motivated by a philosophy of its own, referred to as Olympism. I'm curious, how that idea developed and how we should kind of locate that historically. Does Olympism bear any relationship to the ideas that informed the ancient Greek Olympics, or are we really instead looking at something that emerged from 20th century ideologies, kind of utopian internationalism that arose in the early part of the 20th century?
It's definitely deep Western Civ territory, this, I would say. And above all, it seems to be like a reverb between the 19th century in Europe and the classical heritage. So the Olympics are historical. Right? This isn't like Father Christmas or something. The Olympics were Greek sporting contests that were inserted profoundly into Greek mythology and Greek religion. One of the legends is that Heracles founded the competition in honor of his father Zeus. And Heracles built an Olympic stadium after completing his 12 labors in honors of Zeus, and then following the completion, he walked for 200 steps, and that then became known as the unit of a stadion, from which we get the name stadium or stage. And this then becomes the unit for a race, a foot race, a running race that was held. I mean, we actually have records which seem to suggest that the first ever such race was held in 1776 BC, that is, before the Christian era, so 2,800 years ago. And they were then held fairly regularly after that. The rhythm of every 4 years seems to have established itself at an early stage. They were relatively open competitions. The names of winners are recorded. The Olympics were named after the last winner. The competition centered on this foot race, so whoever was the fastest sprinter in the Greek world would become the father, the name, when his name was given to the competition. As in the present day, the range of competitions expanded, so they ended up with a pentathlon, which consisted of jumping and discus and javelin throwing and racing and wrestling. And so many of the core disciplines of the modern Olympics really do have this heritage. And one key ideological element that then made it attractive at a later stage was this idea of the Olympic truce that allowed athletes from different parts of the Greek world that were famously constantly caught in conflict with each other to travel safely to Olympia to take part in the competition. So that I think is a kind of core element. But it also it ended, along with much of the rest of the Greek world, in the Roman period. Arguably, I think the most likely final competition was held in 393 AD. So it ran for 1,000 years, and then this tradition ended. But it remained present in the classical civ, classical imaginary, and was revived then in Europe in the early modern period. So the first records appear to be in Britain. It really surprised me. But the first revivals of an Olympic idea apparently happened in the Cotswolds, of all places. Olympics in between 1612 and 1642. And then again in the late 18th century, the French Revolution held an Olympic competition. But it's really in the 19th century that it all comes together. And I think there are kind of four strands. One is the revival of the Greek state. So the fact that Greeks gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1821 with the backing of the so-called liberal powers of the time, which supported Greek independence. And so a bunch of Greek patriots rally around the idea of reviving the Olympic ideal. Then you have the English tradition of education centered in the mind and the body. So British private schools, elite private schools in particular, become this highly influential incubator. Matthew Arnold is the key thinker of this, of a program of education that is both cultural and technical, but also above all physical. So the playing fields, the team sports, become a central arena for the formation of gentlemanly upper-class masculinity. And this is a profoundly attractive idea, amongst other for French thinkers and educators in the 19th century. And one of them, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, takes up the English tradition, above all, of this sort of athletic, manly education. It also has a huge influence in the United States. If you think about scholar athletes and the way in which athleticism is celebrated in American universities, it comes from this Greece by way of 19th century England. And then in the 1890s, these three strands, the French activist Baron Pierre de Coubertin, the Greek idea of reviving their own national tradition, the English idea of this gentlemanly amateur sportsmanship, a new kind of chivalry, if you like, merged then in the formation of the IOC and the holding of the first Olympic competitions in the 1890s. And those then move on into the 20th century across the vicissitudes of the centuries. So I think that's the kind of the combination that leads to the first games were held, the first modern games were held in Athens in 1896. So that's the kind of the story. And then it takes on in the 20th century this global reach. But it is undeniably, powerfully inflected by a notion of Western civilization and its particular focus on the body as a zone, and arguably, I think, originally the male body as the zone of a particular idea of beauty, of perfection, of excellence.
So to shift to the current day, the Olympics are organized by, as you mentioned, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, that helps organize these events every 4 years, or every 2 years when it comes to the Winter Olympics as well, mixed in there. I'm curious what kind of organization this is that coordinates this multi-billion-dollar event, and what kind of corporate governance regulates this organization. Because it does seem, for example, that there are problems that arise every now and then with corruption, for example, or doping scandals or other issues that the IOC gets mixed up in. And, how did this organization evolve in a way that allows those problems to fester? And why is there kind of no oversight over this very consequential organization, seemingly?
I think because it's sort of, it's a non-governmental organization. So unless it's involved in various types of fraud, it's sort of created itself, right? So as far as I'm able to understand it, and I find it quite complicated. It seems to be that the IOC consists of 83 members, individuals, people, who represent countries and to an extent also Olympic disciplines. So these are like ambassadors from a country to the IOC, but they're chosen by the IOC. So it's kind of like a sports club, like a golf club or something, right? You have to qualify to be a member and then be voted by the existing members, and then you join the IOC. And that is essentially the governing body of the Olympics. It then spawns committees, the organizing committees for each cycle. And the IOC is also the body which, if you like, provides authority and legitimation to, for the Summer Olympic disciplines, 33 separate sports, say the Judo Association or the Swimming Association, at a global level. And so it's this weird double structure of a governing body which is based on national delegates and a sports-based model, which is based on the disciplines in which people compete. And the whole thing operated on the shoestring, essentially, through to the 1970s. So there wasn't much reason to be corrupt about it because there wasn't much money flowing through it. But from the early 70s, the IOC began to realize, it's a little bit like the story we were telling about the Tour de France. People began to realize that there was money to be made through television rights and through commercial sponsorship. And so that has essentially driven a huge increase in the IOC's revenue. And so in the current cycle from 2017 to 2021, the IOC generated $7.6 billion in revenue, 61% of that coming from broadcast rights and 30% of that coming from sponsorship and then various types of membership fee. And so this is the modern form of the Olympic governance structure, which is a sort of self-appointing, self-selecting group of national representatives who preside over a kind of global licensing agency for sport associations, all of which are clustered together by the desire to stay within the revenue flow generated by the competitions which generate these large flows of sponsorship and TV rights. And it's a disaster waiting to happen, especially in the phase when competition for the right to hold the Olympics was fierce. And so there were a whole series of bribery scandals for Nagano in 1998, the Salt Lake City Games. There were accusations ahead of the Rio Olympics. Potentially illegal payments were made in the course of the Tokyo selection. I have to say, if anyone knows anything about high pressure, event management / construction projects, and essentially the Olympics are a ghastly hybrid of those two forms, it's not surprising to discover that selection processes are not squeaky clean and that side payments are made to make things happen. And, this is a fairly murky world of easy come, easy go relationships with not a lot of repeat business amongst insiders. So none of that I find particularly surprising. And the stakes are relatively small by global standards, after all.
I guess I'm also curious to shift to the kind of athletes who are the stars of the Olympics, obviously. I was wondering how people can afford to be Olympics athletes at all. I mean, most of the competitions involve quite niche sports that require constant training year-round, but there are really no lucrative year-round leagues. So, what is the economic model for someone who wants to make it as a fencer, say, or a high jumper, or pole vaulter? I don't know, name your niche sport. And does that still basically conform to the classical image that you were, referring to at the outset of the amateur athlete?
Yes, I think this is where the discrepancy between the billions of dollars flowing through the sponsorship funds and the reality for most Olympic athletes worldwide really does become glaring and scandalous. Because whilst they're in the youth stages and within the education system, athletes are stars of training programs. But once they get into the critical competitive stage in their 20s, life is tough. I was really quite horrified, to be honest, reading into this. I mean, basically, the vast majority of people engaged in very high stakes athletics who are not the beneficiaries of the sort of, what is it called? I think the Diamond League, the very high end professional runners, for instance, but folks competing by their thousands, and 10,000 people might participate in modern Olympics. The majority of those are really sacrificing for their commitment to the sport. This is the antithesis of sort of professional soccer players or American football or baseball or basketball players who are earning millions of dollars. For sake of comparison, the minimum pay for a player on the practice squad this year in the Professional American Football League is $16,800 per week, right, on the practice squad. For Major League Baseball, players in the minor leagues are paid a minimum of $60,000 per season. And those are both multiples of what athletes in less favored disciplines could expect to be able to earn during their training periods. For the Olympic medals, a gold medal finish earns you $37,000 in prize money, $22,000 for silver, and $15,000 for a third place finisher. But if you think about the costs of training, of living, of dealing with medical bills, which run to $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 per athlete, this is a losing proposition. In other words, you are paying for your passion, you're paying for the glory, certain countries compensate their athletes very generously if they achieve great things in the Olympics for the honor of their country. But that really varies by country. And the fact that you have to forego, right, essentially, if you're in professional training for any one of the demanding physical disciplines, it limits your ability to follow any other profession. People are basically living on minimum wage for a large part of their competitive career. It's really quite extraordinary. And so the gap between that and the feather-bedded sports bureaucrats swanning around from meeting to meeting, all expenses paid, with a $1 billion slush fund to play with, is pretty glaring.
Okay, it's time for a quick break here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about the Olympics. So we all know it's hugely expensive to host the Olympics. Those costs, as we've kind of mentioned, are somewhat offset by broadcasting rights and sponsorships. But I'm curious, what are the broader economic benefits of hosting the Olympics beyond the immediate revenue? I mean, are those benefits generally tangible in the form of increased tourism and trade and investment in the short term? Or are they kind of more intangible in the form of prestige and pride and geopolitical bragging rights? I mean, how should we think about that?
So this question has gone back and forth over the more than half century, really, of the modern era of the highly commercial Olympics since the late 60s and early 1970s. The costs have escalated. We're now talking, for the really large Olympics in Russia and China most recently, of spending that probably ran to tens of billions of dollars. The Paris Olympics, if they keep the bill under 10 billion, will be the cheapest Olympics since the Los Angeles Olympics, which was famously the most commercially successful. And they were able to keep the cost low because they basically used the Californian sports infrastructure that was already in place and made a profit. The Olympics business has been a sort of on a boom to bust cycle, in which after Munich, it was in the early 70s, it was very difficult to get anyone to bid. It was seen as a poison chalice. And then they made a lot of money in Los Angeles. And then competition spiraled. And by the 90s and the 2000s, there was fierce competition for the option to deliver the Olympics. We're now in a situation where in 2021, Brisbane, Australia, which will host the 2032 Summer Games, is the first city to win an Olympic bid unopposed since Los Angeles did in 1984. Right, so people have realized, they woke up and smelled the coffee. The answer to your question, Cam, as we can observe through what's called amongst economists revealed preferences, is that when they've done the math, no one can actually figure out how to make a profit out of this business. It doesn't seem to add up. Certainly in the case of the London Olympics recently, there was a fall in tourist revenue. The legacy argument never seems to work. Paris convinced itself to do the Olympics on the basis that they could use the sports infrastructure that is already amply provided in Paris. They have failed to build a large amount of the infrastructure. A very large part of the city is shut down right now, and hundreds of thousands of tickets are waiting to be sold because I know my daughter had tickets to go to the Olympics this year in Paris. She won them in the lottery and decided to pass them on because the prospect of visiting Paris at this time of year is daunting in any case, but doing so in the Olympic season was just really not a very attractive proposition. So, I think really the idea of the Olympics as a huge tourist draw is increasingly unconvincing, and we're seeing that in the reality. We're seeing that in the fact that cities simply aren't bidding.
We've described this event as sort of representing Western ideals, at least in its origins, but obviously it's a big global phenomenon now and also reflective of global rivalries. And among the countries that has been on the rise in the Olympics has been China. And I wanted to ask about its approach to Olympic success. And it's been described as having a kind of state-driven strategy for this event. And I'm wondering, is that truly distinct from the sporting development models that are pursued elsewhere in the world?
I think the short answer to this is no. So the odd country out, if there's an odd country in terms of the Olympic training program, is not China, but the United States. So the US doesn't have significant federal government funding or any other public mechanism for funding its huge sports infrastructure and its huge Olympic success. Most other countries in the world have national state-sponsored programs or public-private partnerships with a lottery, for instance, that provides a flow of funds and is earmarked. So just to give some points of comparison, Australia, which does very well at the Summer Olympics, spends about $124 million. That's a country with a population of 26 million people. So they're spending about $5 per person. The UK spent £220 million for the Tokyo cycle for a population of 67 million. So again, that's in the sort of maybe $4 range per person. China, with a population of 1.4 billion, 20 times as much as the UK, raised its spending from $1 billion in 2021 to closer to $3 billion in 2023. So that's about $2 per person. It's, just below the rich country kind of average, in no ways exceptional. If you're looking for a really exceptionally heavy public spending program, it's not any of those. It's Norway. So Norway, with a country of 5 million people, spends $400 million in sports sponsorship, from which its Olympic team benefits. That's $80 per person. But then Norway, it's so rich. It's got this huge sovereign wealth fund. It's fairly typical of the choices they make. No, China is in no way at this point exceptional. This isn't a story like in the Cold War era, where the Soviet Union just, concentrated vast amounts of resources on their sporting teams to outcompete the Americans. China does now compete hard in the summer, winter, and strikingly in the Paralympics. So if you actually want to see an area of total Chinese dominance, it's in the Paralympics. They crushed everyone else in the Tokyo Paralympics from the 2020 cycle, earned 207 total medals. That's 83 more medals than the United Kingdom, which placed second. The Chinese have an exemplary, gigantic training infrastructure for disabled athletes, 13,000 specialized community fitness centers across the country. It's really striking that they would make this commitment, and obviously laudable in every way. What I think does tend to freak external Western commentators out about the Chinese sports training programs, it starts so young. So China selects promising athletes at the ages as young as 4, and it has a system of 2,000 state-run sport academies in which these very young people are put through highly intensive training programs. This then, as you'd expect, attracts kind of Western accusations that these are just basically very amply funded little robots. The Chinese response is, we're a huge country. There's still a huge number of poor people in China. We take all our education extremely seriously. The way we do this is we find people all over the country and promote these through these boarding school sports academies, because that's the way in which we can reach a country which still has 30% rural population and hundreds of millions of people living in poverty. Not absolute poverty, abject poverty, but at levels of income that are more like those of a developing economy. And so that's how we build a truly national comprehensive program. The Chinese also, in a very deliberate way, have tried to subvert the robot image by, in fact, encouraging their athletes to have romances during the games. A couple recently got engaged after she won a silver medal. So they're actually trying quite hard to kind of loosen up and project this rather different image of China. But no, one really, I think, has to adjust for the American optic, where it truly is America is exceptional in the extraordinarily low level of public funding for its athletics programs, especially in light of the success which American athletes achieve, which is clearly down to both the mobilization of private resources and the extraordinarily amply funded both high school and college athletics programs. I mean, I think Stanford as a university, comes like 4th or 5th in the national ranking of medal winners. And that's not true of any other university in the world, right? That you have a genuinely globally competitive sports program in a college is also a unique feature of American society and culture.
Yeah, the United States outsources that training to its university system for whatever historical reason. But I guess this does lead to my last question, which is whether we should, in light of all this, be thinking of Olympic competitions as fair at all. And I'm not referring here to kind of in the sense of doping, but more in the sense of material inequalities that we're talking about here and across countries and how those inform sporting development and from there sporting outcomes.
The simple answer is no, it's not fair. And ability to compete is associated with size, because you're basically looking for, freakish, outstanding talent. And so the bigger pool you have to draw from, the more likely you are to find that kind of talent. And the other thing that's decisive is GDP. And so broadly speaking, The Economist found that share of global GDP by itself explains 55% of the variation in Olympic medals won. It doesn't explain everything. There's always going to be a Jamaica where you have, relatively low GDP per capita, relatively small country, and nevertheless this absolutely outstanding tradition of sprinting, right? That is very unusual. But broadly speaking, a 10% higher income per capita predicts a 7% increase in medals per country. So the United States and China are more or less exactly where you'd expect them to be on this kind of curve. Again, to go back to it, in the Soviet era, the Soviet Union was winning medals way outside the boundary of what you'd expect given its GDP per capita. Modern China really isn't like the Soviet Union in the vast majority of respects. It's very, very different. And that's not the kind of world we're in. So China and the US are where you expect. Jamaica is an outlier on the one hand. The great exception on the other side, the one that could really transform the sporting world generally, is India, which massively underperforms in the array of sports which the Olympics select. And this is in part to do with culture. It's part to do with the cultures of the body. It's to do with sporting traditions. And of course, it's also to do with the extraordinary bias of the Olympic competition in which sports they choose to include and what not. And it makes a huge difference to whether or not a society can show off what it's good at. But the consequence of that is that for Jamaica, each gold medal ratios out at the equivalent of about $3 million of economic output. Whereas for India, it's 1,000 times that. It takes $3.5 billion of Indian GDP to produce a medal. So that gives you a kind of sense of just how disparate those performances are. So it's not all about economics. It's also about a range of other factors. But within those societies which compete in the standard Olympic disciplines, GDP does a huge amount of the explanatory work.
Yeah. Well, the events are always a joy to watch. I personally love it. I hope others are enjoying it as well. But yeah, we will stop the conversation here for now, but otherwise be back, as always, next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.